The eerie silence brought on by the disappearance of his brother had lasted 7 years, making its mark on Oliver Baker's life in an indelible way. He hadn't spoken a word since the fire, something that was necessary for him to cope with the trauma of the event. But despite the pain and sadness it brought, he refused to share some details with anyone else, details which would change everything. The fire happened 7 years ago in a house of a rich family of twin toddler brothers, a mother, a father, and a maid. The perfect family, until it wasn't. One day, when the couple went out for dinner, they came back to their mansion on fire and only one twin alive and the other two gone, without a trace. Now, 16 years old, Oliver had learned to live with the reality of the situation. His heart hardened into a rock, and barely anything fazed him anymore. This was reality, he realized. This was truly what it was, an abyss of darkness and a few cracks where light seeps through every now and then. He was unbothered by the opinions of others, but deep down there was still a fear that had haunted him for years. The thought of how his family would react if he told them the truth was always lingering in the back of his mind. He had no idea what their response would be. Would they abandon him? Would they no longer speak to him? Or would they simply get rid of him? Although unbothered on the surface, these queries constantly rattled around in his head and had begun to take its toll on his mental health. He went on, still hoping they would never find out the truth. Except hopes are a form of dreaming against reality. It was on a Christmas morning. The sky was clear and the air was merry. The children cheered and the adults chattered. The happiness was evident, and somehow this air did not enter the heart of Oliver. His sorrowful heart was filled up with nostalgia each time the holiday season came around. He remembered all the good times he and his twin brother Don had shared every Christmas, going out to pick a tree, telling stories around the fireplace, leaving treats for Santa. But a shadow of sorrow hung over those days because of Don's untimely passing away, leaving him with an emptiness that could never be filled. He wished so much to have those memories with him one more time, but it was not to be. Oliver forced himself to get out of bed, to get on with his day, even though he didn't want to. He did it only for his parents. Oliver walked down the stairs to a sight he could only describe in disgust. A multitude of decorations had been hung up, and everywhere he turned, he was met with a reminder that Christmas was here once again. This normally would have been a cause of joy, but all Oliver could feel was an unwilling sense of sadness. Don had been the lesser-liked twin, always, and his death was something that only affected himself personally. He knew the dimming of the lights present tonight really meant something else. "Oliver, you're up," Mrs. Baker said, cheerfully, a pleasant smile painting her worn-out features. He smiled tiredly yet softly, and acknowledged her with a simple nod. Mr. Baker looked up from his newspaper, and the corners of his lips immediately turned up at the sight of his son, and walked up to him, engulfing him in a warm hug. "Merry Christmas, son," he said, as he pressed a soft kiss to Oliver's forehead. Oliver cringed inside as he wrapped his arms around his father. If only they knew the truth. He took a soft bite out of his scrambled eggs as he watched his mother gracefully laying the dishes down on the table. His father, on the other hand, was messing around with the decorations, creating an atmosphere of joy. On the surface, anyone would presume them to be a picture-perfect family leading an ordinary life, only for it to be disrupted as soon as the land phone rang. Everyone immediately tensed up at its peculiar sound within the muted environment. Oliver's father picked up the phone, and his body stiffened in confusion as he realized who was calling. No one used the landline. It hadn't rung in years. So when the sudden ringing filled their home, it sent waves of suspicion through Oliver's heart. His father stood perfectly still with each ring, eventually mustering up enough courage to slowly reach over to where the decorations were strewn around and grab it. As his father finally answered, Oliver could sense a shock from whatever was said on the other side of the line. His lips parted in surprise as he staggered until he stood exactly how he started, silent but attentive, waiting for what this call would mean for him and his family. Mr. Baker nodded, replying with, "Yes, we understand, of course, and we will be there as soon as possible." He carefully placed the phone down and looked at his wife, then at Oliver, taking a deep breath before saying, "It was the police." The stillness of the room was quickly broken as Mrs. Baker's eyes widened in surprise upon hearing from the police. Although talking to officers had been an almost forgotten memory for Oliver and his parents, a sudden spur of confusion had been brought about with this surprising contact. Oliver couldn't help but feel the beats of his heart begin to climb as myriad possibilities began running through his mind, each one more threatening than the last. Could it be possible that something happened to reveal the truth that he was so desperately trying to keep hidden? "What did they say?" Mrs. Baker asked, almost hesitantly. Mr. Baker looked at Oliver as if he didn't want to mention whatever it was in front of him. He let out a sigh and said, "They say a boy has come, claiming to be the missing twin." Oliver sat in silence. The tension in the room was heavy and palpable. No one spoke, no one moved. It was almost as though time had stopped. His father's words, uttered unexpectedly yet carefully, cracked the stagnation of the air with a hint of fear and worry. Oliver already knew truths hidden beneath the surface, but hidden away from everyone else. Nothing his father could say would necessarily surprise him, as he was expecting something like this all along. Still, Oliver didn't expect things to move on to this stage, and neither did anybody else. "I'm sorry, what?" Mrs. Baker started. "Love, you need to calm down. We'll go and see what this is all about." Oliver watched from the breakfast table, still in shock. He wasn't sure how to react. He couldn't look too disturbed. He couldn't look too calm. Afraid of what he might do, he quickly stood up from the table, and his parents looked at him, as though they suddenly realized he was present, concern in their eyes. "Son, you don't have to come," Mr. Baker started. But Oliver shook his head, as if to say, "No, I want to." In reality, he didn't. He wanted to hide himself for the rest of eternity and never face his parents ever again. But that would only make them suspicious. He had to play innocent. Before they knew it, the three of them were in the car and making their way to the police station. Car rides with Mr. Baker usually carried an air of joy and comfort, as gentle music filled the car and eased worry or stress away. But on that fateful day, worry and tension hung over the Baker family thick, like a blanket, replacing cozy tunes with only the tapping of Mr. Baker's finger on the steering wheel, stressing exhales coming from Mrs. Baker, and a harsh silence surrounding them all. Though it was not usually so, this time worry had won over joy. Even though no one said it aloud, worry filled each individual's heart. It had been a long drive full of worry and endless speculation as to what could possibly await them at their destination. When they finally arrived at the police station, Oliver felt his knees wobble. They made their way inside, and it could be said, the boy who made the claim didn't lie. In the police station sat Oliver's long-lost twin brother, Don. The entirety of what happened afterwards was a blur. Oliver wasn't sure what happened. His parents were speaking to the police, they were signing some papers, people were rushing around, and all along, Don was staring right into his soul, his eyes never leaving Oliver. It wasn't angry or betrayed. There was a look of longing in his eyes, but not once did Oliver look up at him. Once they reached home, it was chaos. Oliver immediately went to his room, but he could hear his parents' voices, confused, joyful, stressed, relieved, full of contradictions, but only understandable. As for himself, he didn't know what to feel. He didn't know what to expect, the changes that would follow this great day. It was around 11:15 p.m. when he heard a tap on his room door. He sat up from his bed as his mother entered. She looked exhausted. "Are you okay, Oliver?" He sighed and looked at her. The act was put up for too long. He had to tell her. Oliver watched as his mother's eyes widened as he slowly opened his mouth, and his voice left his throat. He stopped speaking as a coping mechanism, it was true, but what his parents didn't know was, during the past couple of months, he had begun trying to speak again. "I knew, Mom," he said. She gulped, her eyes wide. "What do you mean?" He dreaded this day to come. Every Christmas was a reminder that this day would come. Oliver sucked in a deep breath, preparing himself to explain what happened. "First of all, I'm not Oliver. I'm Don." It didn't take him long to tell the story, how the fire happened. It was an accident, while baking a turkey. A simple task. Who would have thought? Don told his mother how terrified he was. He didn't know where Oliver was, but he saw the maid holding his hand, fear evident in her eyes. To this date, he doesn't know why she escaped with Oliver and never returned. Was it fear of being arrested? Was the accident not an accident at all? He spoke of how she suddenly spoke out loud and said, "Don, if you're in there, you are not to mention a word to anyone, not to any living soul." His mother inquired then, the question he didn't want to be asked. "Why did you pretend to be Oliver?" Don massaged his forehead. "As soon as you and Dad found me, you assumed I was Oliver, which is funny, considering the fact that both of you are my parents. It's all right, though. Oliver was always the better-liked twin." "No," his mother tried to interrupt, but Don sighed and shook his head. "It's okay, Mom. I thought it would only make you two happy if you believed I was Oliver. It wasn't difficult to convince both of you either. Oliver dropping his grades could just be because of trauma, not being as sporty because he simply couldn't bring himself to after the tragic accident. Oliver became Don, and you still loved me, which was reassuring enough. I knew Oliver was alive. I bumped into him around 2 years ago, and from then, we would keep updating each other on our lives. The maid had brought him up. She cared for him. She really did. Oliver said he assumed that she had some mental instability because of her odd behavior. Nothing made sense, but he couldn't escape because..." Don gulped. "She would beat him up if he did." He watched as tears streamed down his mother's cheeks. The entire situation was confusing, painful, and it felt as though all of it could have been avoided if he had just spoken. But there was something about the way the maid told him not to tell anyone that compelled him to oblige. A week ago, the maid killed herself. I knew this was coming. Another thing the maid mentioned was, "Wait for Christmas, and he will return." It's as though she already knew I was in the house. She knew perfectly well I was away from the fire, alive and listening. Mrs. Baker held her forehead. Don, this is a lot." That's when the dams threatened to be released. Don gulped. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Tears streamed down his face like waterfalls, and he hiccuped. "I'm so sorry. Love, listen. No." His mother holds him then, wraps her arms around him, despite hurting inside herself, despite the confusion, despite everything. He was still her son, and she loved him more than she could ever love herself. "It's all right. Things are strange. This will take a while to digest, for both your father and I. But we will get through it, I promise you. No matter what it is, we will get through it." Dawn sobbed into her shoulder and held her tighter. "It will be the four of us again. Dawn, Oliver, Dad, and Mom. I promise," Mrs. Baker whispered, and just then, she felt another pair of arms wrapped around them. "Mr. Baker." "I heard," he said simply, his voice breaking. They stayed like that for a while, until Mr. Baker finally said, "It's Christmas. It's nearing the end of the year. It's time for change. It's not too late." The three of them clasped their hands together, foreheads leaning against one another. Here's to a new year, a year of new beginnings.